This is my turnout on a Sunday. So, for those of you who don't know, my name is Suman. This is my center. And this is the first time I'm doing this in this way. And what the purpose of this today here is for me to kind of share with all you guys my own experiences and how I've put together various threads from different traditions all over the world that we're all kind of familiar with, but how I put them together in a way that makes sense to us sitting here in the West, in America. So, with social media these days, there's so much out there, right? All over the place. And a lot of it's great, a lot of it isn't, and a lot of it's very confusing, right? And so I'm gonna go through and kind of see where you guys are in just a minute, but assuming all of you here are here because you're interested in spirituality in general, right? And so, but what that means kind of is what we're going to get into today, like the nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts. Me putting together everything I've gathered over my years, and I've been into what you would call spirituality since I was a kid, but mainly since college. I was raised Hindu. I was born in India, but I came here when I was two and a half. So, but I was raised essentially Hindu. And I'll get into that, what that means too in a bit, for those of you who may not know or be familiar with that. But growing up, I was always surrounded by essential Hindu elements that are part of the religion. So I kind of took it for granted. I would see my mother with her shrine in her bedroom. All Hindu households, usually the mother has a shrine in a room, and that shrine is almost like the church, is the idea, right? And so on that shrine are various depictions of God. And so I grew up, and I'll kind of explain what that kind of means as we go along. But, for a Hindu, there is no one definition of God, is the thing, right? And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that, just seeing you smile. But there's no one definition of God. It's very all-encompassing, very inclusive of anything you can really conceive of. It'll fit into the Hindu model. So I grew up with that. On the shrine, there was Christ, Mother Mary. There was the Buddha. There was Krishna. There was Durga, right? And so for the Hindus, like more the merrier. But the point is that's how I grew up, seeing that. My mother would sit after her shower every day, sit in front of her shrine and do mantras. Repeat certain sounds they're basically prayers or sayings to remind you of God, essentially, right? So I would see that growing up. And growing up, we would openly talk about past lives. We'd openly talk about karma, reincarnation. We'd openly acknowledge ghosts and spirits around us. Oh, did you see that this morning? I saw someone walk through. Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Okay, what did it look like? Right? So that was normal, right? I grew up with that. And so then with my own life experience, what happened was, in elementary school, fifth grade, I went to a public school. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. So I went to a normal public school at that time, in the, I'm gonna date myself, but 70s and 80s. But so I got in trouble for participating in a food fight in the cafeteria. So my parents, to give me more discipline, they were like, okay, we need to put him in a private school. We're going to put him into a Catholic private school. Because in India, Catholic schools have a prestige, right? So, it's kind of a holdover from the colonial era in India, but they're usually a little more better maintained, more disciplined, all those things. So in their mind, Catholic schools were better, okay? So I went to a Catholic school from 5th through 8th grade. And so I learned a lot about the Bible, right? I read the Old Testament, the New Testament, went to Mass every Friday. Of course, I couldn't go up and do communion, right? Being a non-Catholic. being the only non-Catholic in the school. So, right, I would sit there and watch everyone kind of go up to communion. I'd be like, okay, that's cool. I was interested and curious, but just kind of accepted my fate and not a big deal, whatever. In every other, case, I was included, right? So I learned a lot about Christ and Catholicism and in general Christianity. So I go to college now and I'm a freshman in college. I want to meet people. I want to meet girls. So I would start hanging out with where I grew up, there weren't any Indians around, right? So this is the 80s in the Midwest, right? I went to high school in Indiana. So I think there was one or two other Indians in the whole high school, if you can imagine that, right? So that's how I grew up. We had our own community outside of school in our social sense, but in school, I'm not seeing anyone that looks like me, right? So I'm in college now. I go to a nice college in the Midwest, and there are lots of Indians here. And so I want to meet some, right? So I find out where the first Hindu study group is, and I attend. And I have no clue what they're talking about. So they're pulling out excerpts from the Bhagavad Gita, talking about it. I have no idea what they're saying. I'm like, what is going on? And so I realized, one of the detriments to a religion like Hinduism that's so open-ended and inclusive, there's not much structure. And so I didn't get that growing up, right? I was immersed in the culture, in the ideas, but I didn't really learn. There's no, back then, like Hindu study group growing up, like there was Bible study here for Christians and Catholics, right? So I didn't know anything. I knew about Krishna, but that's it. I saw his face often everywhere I went, but that's it. So I'm sitting in a Hindu study group and I'm like, what are they talking about? And that sparked then my first real awakening. I was like, okay, hold on. I'm interested in this. Let me find out what's going on. So I would go to my college library and start checking out books and start actually reading more of those books than what I majored in. Okay. Which I don't use any of right now, my major. It was engineering. I was well programmed growing up as a good Indian boy, right? So I was engineering and pre-med. Yep. So that's when I started to kind of break out of my programming, right? And so I dove into the religion of my birth, which, when we get into that's really important, in my opinion, for everyone to really understand the good and the bad of the religion of their birth, right? And so, but then that quickly brought me into Buddhism, quickly brought me into Taoism, into the other religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, the mystical sides of every religion. I quickly connected to, right? And then, of course, this is like the 90s, mid 90s, the new age is blossoming and, full on. So that was part of it too, kind of integrating all of that. What are all these people saying? They're channeling, they're writing these books, all these things, right? So that's how I began my journey. And I first started to learn how to meditate really 20 years ago 30 years ago at this point. So I learned TM, was my first experience in meditation. But really what brought me to that was reading a few books that blew my brain. And one was the autobiography of a yogi. Anyone know that? Good. Okay. So that just blew my brain open. Like, what is going on? Wow. And so I have to learn how to meditate. Okay. So I found the local TM. TM was big. Anyone not know what TM is? TM is transcendental meditation, right? That was the first. And so just briefly to pause here, I'm going to be talking a lot about a lot of things, and I may be all over the place today, but there's a common theme and element with everything I'm going to say. And so if something is confusing or you don't know where I'm going, just let me know. And part of this will be a discussion later on. But I promise I will tie everything together, no matter where I go. So transcendental meditation was the first major iteration of meditation in the West, brought forth by a man called Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And if, for those of you who don't know, he heavily influenced the Beatles. He heavily influenced hippie culture in the 60s, 70s, dramatically, right? So many celebrities latched onto him. And he wasn't the first Hindu-based Indian yogi that came over, but he was one of the most influential, right? So he promoted a form of meditation called transcendental meditation. And he had a great organization. It spread like wildfire in the US. And so that's what most people had access to, right? And it's a very, what's called a mantra-based, you repeat certain sounds to focus your mind. Essentially, that's it, okay? So I learned that and started doing that. Didn't really get too far, you know. So I continued to explore various aspects of spirituality as time went on. And then, you know, I was in, for those of you who don't know, my main profession is in natural health care. So I'm a chiropractor. My license is chiropractic. I'm also a naturopath. So when I was in chiro school, I was already into energy work. I was already, you know, a Reiki master before I entered chiro school. I was already meditating. So, and by that time, late 90s, you know, a lot of the new age was really coming on board. And so I was diving into a lot of that stuff and trying to really piece together how it all fit with really the essential Hindu, Buddhist structures I was kind of really getting into. So then early 2001, I went to my first 10-day retreat, 10-day Buddhist retreat, a Vipassana retreat. Who has been to one? Who's familiar with? Okay, so I went to my first one of many I've been to since then. That just put me into a whole different trajectory, right? Hands down, in my opinion, one of the greatest things one can do if they're interested in meditation, in spirituality, to take something like that, specifically that retreat that I did, unbelievable. It immersed me into the original Buddhist teachings, the authentic teachings of the Buddha, because that retreat is based on for those who may not know, the original Theravada Buddhist lineage that was the first offshoot from the Buddha. Okay, and I'm going to talk a lot about the Buddha, but he's very important. So 10 days of meditating, 10 hours a day. Imagine that in silence. Okay, now breaks in between, of course, hour break, right? So you're doing that 10 hours a day for 10 days. It blows you open, right? You are faced with your stuff like never before. Pain, discomfort, emotional pain, physical pain, right? My wife did it with me at one point, you know, and dramatic, right? And so I've done that a number of times, but once when I was there, I, for the first time, understood what the Buddha was trying to teach. And when you understand what he was trying to promote, stripped down to his original essence, so much makes sense, especially in spirituality. No matter what spirituality you're doing, things start to fall into place. Okay, and I'm going to get into that in a bit. Okay, so from then on, you know, I started to integrate essential mindfulness, insight, Buddhist practices and teachings into everything I was doing, especially my practice became based on that, and how I work with patients and clients was based on understanding how you feel your sensations, how you feel your pain, how you process those things, and change how your mind is reacting to those things. All of that is basic Buddhism, right? Now we know it a lot because it's infiltrated psychology, right? For those of you who know of the mind-body approaches in psychology, somatic therapy, all those things. That's where it comes from, right? The original Buddhist teachings. So then eventually I started to integrate Taoist teachings. Okay, now that is a whole different ballgame because it really helps you understand energy in your body and around us and what's called the cultivation of that energy. And we'll talk about that, right? Because that's kind of an essential element of spirituality that everyone's kind of doing. They may not realize it, or they may acknowledge it, but they may be kind of circling around doing something and not progressing, or they may be doing it and they realize what they're doing, but it's very difficult, so they get a little confused. It's tricky, right? But the Taoists specialized in that over thousands of years, how to cultivate that internal vital force dramatically, okay? So every culture specialized in different things is the thing, which is what's amazing, okay? But what I'm trying to spread is this idea that there is a universal form of spirituality that is inherent to being human, okay? That different religions, spiritual systems, traditions focus on different angles of it. Some a little more clearly, some very confusingly, right? But the main gist of all of them are pretty much the same. But this, what I'm calling universal spirituality, is not dogmatic. That's the rub here. You see? That's why it's not really a religion. And that's why religions come from it, because of dogma and attachment to what they view as the way to do things, right? But this universal system of spirituality is so old, it's so ancient. I'm fascinated by it, in terms of how it has spread and influenced every religion from the beginning. Okay, so now I am biased, okay, because as we're going to get into in a bit, the essential core teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism, the wisdom traditions from India, are a big deal in this regard. And I'm going to explain why, okay? And the key is to understand, though, the original wisdom teachings of India were not dogmatic, even though certain elements may seem so now, right? As things are practiced culturally, especially, right? So now, let's pause for a second, okay? And let me just get kind of a show of hands for anyone who's never meditated. Great. So what about people who were originally part of Christianity and the church? Okay, yeah. And so Judaism. Okay. Buddhism, or even Hinduism, or anything else. Okay. Anyone not really grew up with any spiritual system or religion? Okay, so something we're all used to. Okay, so who here feels like they've tried to meditate, but it's hard? Okay, who here feels like they made some progress with meditation? Yeah, awesome. Good. Who here is still unsure as to why you're meditating? Okay, yeah. Who here understands the word enlightenment? Good. Who here has no idea and is very confused about that word? Okay. So where I want to start is the idea that spirituality is really the pursuit of reconnecting. Is what it comes down to something greater. right? And so, um, as I'm speaking, let me know if you disagree with something. Because look, I don't have all the answers, right? And I'm not sitting here in front of you to be a guru, okay? To be very clear, I'm really, a spiritual researcher, okay? I'm a seeker, just like each one of you. I like to delve into, deep dive into certain things that I find fascinating, right? And I do have the ability to put things together, right? To really bring two different elements together and see, okay, here's what they're really talking about, and kind of synthesizing and integrating things. So, and that's kind of what I'm bringing to you guys, that whole idea, right? So the essence of all spirituality is this notion that we're trying to reconnect to something greater, correct? Okay, so most of us will term that God, ultimately speaking, okay? Now, that's a charged word, obviously. It means many things, okay? So everything I'm going to say, I'm going to fall back on what I mentioned before, this universal spirituality. And so in that regard, why I mentioned Hinduism specifically as a very important element here is to pull that word apart, Hinduism. That's what I'm going to do right now, okay? To help you understand where I'm going with this. So Hinduism is a word that we've used for a few hundred years, but it doesn't really define what it's supposed to mean, okay? Because Hinduism on one hand is cultural, very similar to Judaism, okay? It's cultural, but most of it is not. It is what is originally called Sanatana Dharma in Sanskrit, right? Sanatana means eternal, Dharma means the truth, the way. That's how they knew it in India, right? Everything fell under that category in the whole subcontinent of India, thousands of years ago, okay? Thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, long time ago. So under that, the idea was there were teachers and guides always to show us the way. Ancestors, teachers, guides. They were the ones who were letting us know the way. That's how it was understood, you see? So there wasn't one way, because all these teachers and guides, and in the Indian system, they're called rishis, maharishis, rishis, which means basically the wise ones, right? So the entire body of what we call the religion of India, the religion of Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, is based on literally what we've compiled of what these teachers express to the general public. What they were expressing was unified, is the thing. It was a unified idea. But there was variety within that. And that's what makes Hinduism very confusing, very complicated when you try to look at it. Just Wikipedia and Hinduism. Good luck. Right? Who's done that? I encourage you to, So if you want to be confused, do that. Because what you're going to quickly see is literally they say Hinduism is 6 philosophies. What? And there are a whole compilation of books. What? The common thread is what's called Vedanta. Who is not familiar with that word? Great. So in Vedanta, Vedanta, okay? So that's a term that is a definition for the philosophy of what's in the Vedas. Vedas. Vedas are a compilation of all the original works in ancient India that spawned, and I'll explain this, that's literally was the backbone and spawned much of modern day spirituality.
Much of what?
Modern day spirituality. And if it didn't spawn it, it's encased in the original teachings of Vedanta, which is what's mind-blowing. And so what is that? Well, like I was saying, the original thrust is God is everything. That's how it begins, right? Brahman is all. Now, Brahman is the word for God in Vedanta. And the Vedanta gets into what God is. And so, in my opinion, they do that more than any other system I've ever come across. That's what they specialized in. What is God? Literally, from the beginning. Okay? And so when you get that, you're like, oh, now I see what the Christians are talking about. Now I see what Buddhists are a different story. We'll talk about that. But I see what, we're great spirituals, and I see what, these other religions, paganism, all these things are talking about, where this idea that there's only one totality. There's one absolute. That's Brahman. Brahman, Brahman. It literally is translated as the vastness. That's what it means, Brahman, the expanse, the vastness. Right? So the idea is they got into what that means, which is, from the human understanding, there are two elements to Brahman. It's immanent, right here, right now. All of us are part of it. The universe is part of it. Every subatomic particle is it, right? It's immanent, is what it means. Here and now. All things are part of it. It's also transcendent. It's also beyond all this. Okay. That kind of covers it, right? Yeah. Now, from there, now it starts to get complicated, because then the immanent and transcendent start to get even more defined to help us understand, right? And so these rishis were trying to help us understand what they realize themselves is the idea, right? So it's like imagining there are like 100 Christs, each with a different personality and a different way of doing things, writing everything down, and that was compiled. Literally, that's what I'm talking about. Okay? That's how these beings were, revered in ancient India. So the immanent God, Brahman, in Sanskrit is Nirguna Brahman, Saguna Brahman. Nirguna is the formless, all that is. Saguna is the Brahman who is manifest. The immanent, the transcendent. They give them terms, right? And now, the immanent Brahman gets even further clarified. This is now where it gets open-ended. This is now where they gave you the choice. How do you want to connect to the God here and now that you are part of, is the idea. Right? So then the confusion of Hinduism starts to clarify. How do they believe in so many different gods? It's not that. God has infinite names and forms. Okay. It's the other way around. You see? So the predominant so what I'm sharing with you is I will clarify what has been handed down with tradition and what is my opinion. Okay. And what I've gathered and put together myself, okay, based on what I've researched myself and experienced. Okay. So it is my opinion, and much agreed upon in most cases, that the original form of God was the divine feminine on the planet, right? The form of the goddess. And we see that in archaeology. We see that everywhere. That's the first iteration of how humans tried to personify God. Okay, so now Hinduism says the same thing. Okay, because the idea is Brahman is then, as it's essentially, you start to split it in your mind into formless and with form, it's given then attributes, the masculine and the feminine. Right? That's all that happened. In terms of how they're described in their nature. You see? So Brahman is described as what's called Sat Chit Ananda. It's a very Hindu term. You may have come across it. Sat means existence. It exists. Right? Chit means consciousness. It's alive. It is conscious as we perceive, as we understand consciousness, right? It's a being. Ananda, bliss. That's how they describe God, right? Sat Chit Ananda. All that is. So then, as God manifests in the multiverse, and in the ancient world, they would talk about a multiverse, by the way, especially Hinduism, a multiverse. As God manifested the multiverse, that takes the form of how they're described as the goddess. That's where it comes from in Hinduism. And in my opinion, most of the ancient world, right? It's the easiest way for us to understand it. The one who gives birth, right? The feminine. So that's what Hinduism did. And, most, if you've ever dove into Hinduism, you quickly see a whole set of deities. There are two sets of deities. Who knows what I'm talking about? Yeah, there are two sets of deities, which is very interesting in Hinduism. One is specifically mentioned, the first set is mentioned in the Vedas, which is their stories. And they're very human-like. And they correspond very similarly to the other ancient gods of what we call the myths of the world, right? The Greek, the Roman, the Norse. Many of the pagan, the indigenous, the African religions have a core set of deities, right? Usually numbering 10 to 12, which is very interesting. A chief god, and then different roles they play, these different deities play, right? And most of us are familiar with like the Greek mythology, right? But that was also in India, right? Indra was the chief of the gods, like Zeus, right? And there's a whole family. But what you also see is another set of beings talked about. Shiva, Vishnu, forms of the divine feminine, Durga, Kali, Saraswati, Lakshmi, right? Ganesh, Murugan, Skanda, all this whole set of like, who are they? Where'd they come from? Right? Now, what we found is in the Indus Valley civilization that they're really diving into and seeing how expansive and what it was, which for those of you who know the Indus Valley, who doesn't know the Indus Valley? So the Indus Valley was contemporary with Sumer in Egypt and the Yangtze civilization in China and Maya. But the Indus Valley is what they found in northern India along those rivers, right? So the Indus Valley areas they've excavated, all of Sumer, Egypt, ancient China, Maya fits into the Indus Valley. It was that expansive. It's pretty mind-blowing. And it's nearing Göbekli Tepe dates. For those who are interested, 8,000, 9,000 BC is what they're like coming across in terms of what they're excavating, right? And there are certain writings they found called the Indus Valley Seals, very similar to the cuneiform in Sumer, right? And so they're finding reference to Shiva back then. We're talking before 5,000 BC. Okay? And so, in my opinion, what most of Hinduism has now come to see as various forms of God, Shiva, Vishnu, Durga. We're beings. In my opinion, we're beings that inhabited our planet at some point. At such a time period that we can't even conceive of, that we have no memory of. And, I don't want to digress too much, but, there's fantastic research coming out, even, diving into the Old Testament and some of the origin stories of some of the Old Testament stories and some of the characters in there, right? And how Elohim is plural and is considered a group of beings, not just one person, right? And Yahweh was one of many, right? But that's a whole different rabbit hole. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, in my opinion, I think on Earth, there were humanoid beings living here that mainstream archaeology would just completely ignore, right? But which spawned the spiritual systems we have now. And in ancient India, they specifically say they did. This is the thing, okay? In Hinduism, the first yogi is Shiva, the Adi yogi. The first yogi who taught all of yoga to humanity is the idea. All of it comes from Shiva, the blue-skinned guy that you see everywhere, who's sitting in a lotus position, right? Okay. He's the meditator. But he had a family. He was married. He got married. He had kids. They describe that in the myths of India. What do they mean? But yet, you have a whole class of Hindus who literally perceive Shiva as God. When they call upon God, they call upon Shiva. Whole class of Hindus that call upon Vishnu. He's got tons of stories. He did all kinds of stuff. Right? Whole class of Hindus that see God as the divine feminine. The part of India I'm from, right? We would call upon God as the mother. So when my mom would pray to God, she'd say, Ma. She would say, Ma, mother, please, blah, 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 right? That's what I grew up with. That's what's normal for me, you see. So a whole class of Hindus that see God as the mother. Durga, Kali, Saraswati. But they each have stories too. They got dramas, stories, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They're fighting bad guys, winning wars, making mistakes. Right? What is going on? So these ancient rishis in India, they specifically say, what we are telling you was handed down to us from them. And here's what they said. They said that this is what God is. We are all emanations of God. And so the next step is the idea of Atman, soul. If you're spiritual, you've come across, you've struggled with what is the soul. Am I right? So in Vedanta, they specifically tell you their word for soul is Atman. Okay? Atman is a literal spark of the divine. One and the same, no difference. That's how it's described. And the typical analogy is, many of you may know, that like a drop of water is the same as the ocean. But it looks like a drop of water. Or a wave looks like a wave. I see a wave. Oh, but I know it's the ocean. But if I look at the wave, I see the wave. But if I look back, I see the ocean. Right? That's how it's described. Each wave is a soul. Each drop is an Atman that is still part of the ocean. Oh, okay. Can we just say we're God? No, see, that's kind of, if you ever, and I love listening to Christian apologists and Christian people who would take some of these things in other religions, kind of run with it because they don't understand what they're really talking about. So, and one of the big things of the New Age too is this idea of becoming like a god. Who's kind of familiar with that? Yeah. Okay. So, ascending and becoming godlike, right? It's this theme. You can't escape it. Scientology says the same thing, right? For those of you familiar, they're wanting to become like a god, right? Most of the occult traditions go into the same thing. They want to harness powers to become godlike. What's going on? What is the truth? But now Hinduism acknowledges that. The ancient systems of the world acknowledges that. Oh yeah, you can, but you're not God. You may have the spark within you, but it's so covered and clouded with layers of stuff, you can't even access it, is what they're going to say. See, that's what these ancient rishis were telling us. Yeah, you are the Atman. But you forget that. You can't see it. And they tell you why. Because the senses are so strong. The material world is so alluring. We get caught up in it. We get immersed in it, right? It's like diving into the pool and forgetting you can come up. Think about it. That's kind of what we're doing. We've dove into the pool and swimming around in the pool and enjoying the pool inside. We've forgotten that, there's a surface that you can come up to breathe. That's what they said, right? And really what it is when they get into the nitty gritty, like I said, the senses are so strong, it's our attachment. It's the ignorance. We forget that we are the Atman. We start to believe what we sense is real, is the only reality, is the thing. And so then they go a step further and say, okay, to help you understand, you need to understand what you are beyond the Atman, right? So then they get into, once they tell you the problem, and the Buddha said something similar, the problem is suffering, right? We're all suffering. So it's kind of a more focused way of saying it. And then the Buddha said there's a remedy. There's a way out. And the way out is if you do this. And so he was literally, the Four Noble Truths are basically a specific focused retelling of these essential truths in original Hinduism. There is God in the soul. That's ultimate reality. That's who you are, right? But there's a problem now. You've forgotten. You've lost touch. You feel stuck. You're suffering. You're mired in pain, in aversion. Maybe you have moments of joy and love, but it doesn't last. Hence, that's what the Buddha calls suffering, right? We keep returning to pain. We can't escape it, but we keep trying to, but we can't. So we feel stuck. So we're searching for a way, right? And that's what leads you into the spiritual path. You're searching for a way. And so in ancient India, a way was given. These guys were like, okay, guys, there's a way. Just so you know. We'll tell you what to do. Here's what you do. And they laid out a plan. In hint, it's going within, right? That's how, it's the basic gist. Learn how to go within, and there's a path then laid out once you do that. Okay, then what? So then if you do that, they told us what happens, ultimately. And they're very clear about it, and they were like, we did it. The ones writing these things. We did it. So we're speaking from experience. And we're letting you know how we did it. And where we are is we fully know that we are part of God. But we also know that we're also human. That's the thing now, right? Being human and divine. And you can break that down even more. Being human can mean other things too, right? But the point is, both have to be integrated and united, is the thing. So the common thread in the ancient systems of India is, to put it very succinctly, is going from duality to non-duality. That's what it comes down to. Either or to just one. That's really it. It all comes down to that. Human divine integrate into one. Feeling separate, you don't feel separate anymore. You feel reconnected. That's all that is, right? We all know what we're talking about, right? Yes? So they literally said, we'll show you what to do, and here's how you do it. And we are living proof of that. Now, what was the living proof? Let me just mention that, okay? So, in ancient India, like I said, these rishis, these Maharishis, they were living examples from time immemorial of how to be, okay? So, who's read the Yoga Sutras? Or like knows about the Yoga Sutras? Yeah, kind of, if you've been into yoga, you kind of know about it. Who's heard about siddhis, powers, right? Being able to do miracles, right? What Christ did. Christ was doing miracles all over the place, right? He said you can do all these things and more, right? Oh yeah, that's what they were saying too. Right? In the ancient world, they were saying that all over the place. But yeah, look, once you realize who you are and stop acting like just a human, you gain access to more than being human. You follow? Mm-hmm. That's what they were showing. So all of what we have in modern day Hinduism, all the tantra traditions, all the Kundalini yoga traditions, all the yoga-based traditions, all the philosophy, it was handed down by these specific lineages that were held intact in India for thousands of years, that codified what these people were saying and writing them down as manuals, and then oftentimes keeping them secretive, sometimes exposing them, sometimes letting people know publicly, which then became bigger sects and traditions. And then the common people would then kind of filter through that and kind of focus on what was simple and easy. And that's what we have now. That is Hinduism. That's it. The Buddha was one example of that came out with a very specific message, you see? So whenever he was alive, and there's controversy actually when he was alive, by the way, we assume 400, 500 BCE, right? There's actually controversy behind that if you dive into it, just so you know, right? And there's 1800 to 3000 BC is a lot of different divergent theories. In any case, the point is, what the Buddha brought forth, and who doesn't know the story about the Buddha? Great. Yeah, so he basically brought forth a very specific way to go about what these ancients were talking about, okay? So for those of you who are familiar with some of the ideas of Vedanta that I just mentioned, and it kind of have been it's very popular now there are what's called Neo-Vedanta, people talking about Vedanta, original Vedanta, people talking about Vedanta. Most of the Indian gurus that came over from the East oftentimes will talk about Vedanta, right? Which is kind of what I'm sharing with you. So, but they always wouldn't mention that they're talking about Vedanta, but they kind of are, right? So the idea is that if everything is all that is, there has to be a way to realize that, to experience that in real time. That way gets lost, is the problem. if you purely focus on it as a philosophy, it doesn't work too well. Okay, because that's where you get into, oh, it's all an an illusion. It's all Maya. This isn't real. That's dangerous, right? And that's what a lot of people actually remark against when they criticize some of these ideas. If you just imagine it, oh, I imagine we're all one. I can do whatever I want, right? We're all one. I love everyone. It's all, one love, oneness, and some of these things may sound familiar, right? In a lot of circles, right? But that doesn't work because you're ignoring a lot. And you're specifically ignoring your human part, which is specifically your shadow. It's ignored very easily and quickly. Okay? And the shadow is what these ancients were warning against. That's where you need to put your focus and work on. And all of their techniques and practices were geared towards addressing your shadow first. That's what gets lost to now with a lot of what we have out there. You can imagine you're feeling love all the time. And maybe when you're meditating, you have some ecstatic experiences. Great. Maybe you feel tingly all over. And you imagine like, oh, I can imagine I'm like one with everything. Wonderful. Then you're done meditating. You go outside. A mosquito bites you. Or you go home, you sit in the car and you're hungry. You lose all of that. Where'd it go? Right? The point is we are constantly shifting back and forth. We can't sustain anything is the problem, right? Everybody can have an exalted experience, a divine experience of being one. Being in love is that, right? Pure unconditional love. But it can go away. You stub your toe, it's gone in that moment, right? Your kids are, yelling. It's gone. So the idea is how to make these states that we're all seeking. Everybody wants to feel good, have more joy, be more peaceful, be more tranquil, right? Be connected, be aware, be intuitive, all these things, right? And that's kind of why you're doing what you're doing, whatever you're doing. But you can't sustain it. Am I right? It doesn't last. Now, as you progress, you are able to sustain certain things. Yes. That means you're doing the work. Good job. Especially if you're addressing your shadow. And that's what the Buddha focused on. He was like, look, I'm going to focus on a way to put Vedanta into practice. Because when he was alive, he was fully aware of these ancient systems and philosophies, understandings, right? But it takes rigorous practice and meditation to do what these beings were trying to have you do. You have to go to a monastic setting, you have to go away from society, you've got to devote yourself, go within, follow instruction, and it's hard. It's hard. And so the Buddha was like, okay, I'm going to show a different way for people to do this. And just so you know, the Buddha's way is not the only way. I'm going to get into that in a minute. Okay? So the Buddha was like, okay, for those of you who can't go to a monastery or an ashram, the normal person with a family and work, here's what you can do. And that's when he laid out his teachings of beginning with mindfulness, leading to insight, how to learn how to handle what you feel right now without reacting to it. That's it. How do you handle your pain? right? Pain is the crux of suffering. We don't like our pain. We don't want to feel it. And so he taught specifically how to feel pain without pushing it away. And when you do that, magic happens. And that's what he described and laid out in detail how to. Right? And tell me if I'm wrong, the moments that you guys have had maybe a cathartic awakening or healing is usually from something like that. You have gone through some suffering or pain and come out the other side transformed and changed, right? Yeah, so we know it works. And so the Buddha gave a specific way how to get so good at it, you don't have to try anymore. So it's amazing. And that's kind of what I really learned in my 10-day retreat when I was there 20 years ago, right? How he went about doing that and teaching that, right? And that's what the essence of what modern day mindfulness is that everyone has come across, right? But most settings, mindfulness is limited to how they practice and teach it. It originated dramatically by, John Kabat-Zinn, who brought mindfulness to the mainstream in the 70s, especially in the academic setting, right? Which is wonderful. But the way mindfulness is practiced is just a small tip of the iceberg to its potential, which is what the Buddha taught, because it leads to what's called insight, wisdom, transcendental wisdom, the ability to perceive reality as it is, not as you would like it. Right? We know what projection means, right? Yeah, that's reality as you would like it. So how do you not do that? Well, you have to train yourself. You have to train your mind. It's work. That's what the Buddha brought forth. Okay? So now, backing up a step, as I mentioned, this is not the only dramatic way to go about doing this, though. In Hinduism, we got this dude, Krishna, that was around a long time ago. And again, there's controversy when he was around too, right? And from what I've gathered, it's somewhere between 3000 to 5000 BC, in that range. So he's famous for the Bhagavad Gita, right? Which is small little book, very readable, a little less confusing than general Hinduism, okay? Who is looked into the Gita? Yeah, it's very common, right? That's what the Hare Krishna people love, right? Handing out the Gitas everywhere, okay? That's what they do. Yeah, that's what they specialize in, for better or worse, okay? But the Gita is the essential teachings of this being called Krishna, who is compared to Christ in general comparative religion, and for good reason. Okay, so here's a whole story, but in the Gita, it is almost like a summary of Vedanta with some extra details, right? And what's very special in there is he explains how there are multiple paths back to God, back to the divine, back to fully realizing who you are. And once you see that and understand that, everything starts to make sense. Based on what you believe in your spirituality and religions, all starts to kind of fall into the place, right? What did he say? He said, look, there are essentially two ways. Through the mind, through the heart. So it's called Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga. The path of knowledge and wisdom, the path of devotion, surrender through the heart. He said, essentially, whatever path you take, you're going to get to the same place, but it's going to look very different. And you're going to use different words. And you may fight about it too, because you think yours is better. It's just different. And so when you understand that, you see, oh, Buddhism falls here. any type of analysis really falls here. Philosophy falls here. Any type of, Buddhism is about sifting through what we think of as the self and saying what you're not and what you are, right? You're not your thoughts, you're not your sensations, you're not your body, you're more than that. What are you? And you really see that the self is constantly changing and impermanent, right? These are essential Buddhist teachings, right? And they're also Hindu teachings, but he's focused on these specific aspects. If you're constantly changing, what are you? And so the big criticism of Buddhism is, oh, he said there's no soul either, right? That's what you kind of read if you come across that. If you're nothing, it's all empty. Pure emptiness. If you're not your thoughts, if you're not your sensations, if those are always changing, your body changes. And this idea is, even when your body dies, there's still a continuity of something, is the idea, right? So, but even that eventually will fall away. What's left? So the idea is the Buddha gave you a method of the path of wisdom to get to a true understanding. The Buddha never said there was no soul, is the thing. He talked about anatta, which means non-self. And what I want to express is the Buddha gave you a method of seeing what you're not. And if one looks at, when you look at like the Tibetan traditions, the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, and the Theravada traditions, when you listen to some of the enlightened beings in those paths talk, they're saying the same thing. After they realize that their self is pretty much nothing, they realize they're part of one thing. You get back to the same place. You follow? This is what Vedanta is saying from the beginning, right? The Buddha gave a method to get there. And so Krishna was also saying there's the path of devotion as well. You don't have to understand any of this. Krishna was saying, forget it. It's complicated. You don't have to understand. If you fully surrender to God, and in the story, Krishna is being the avatar of God, just like Christ. We'll talk about it in a second, what avatar means. But so the idea is, and Krishna said specifically in the Gita, I am the way. If you surrender to me fully, you will know the truth. Just like Christ said. But Krishna added an extra line, which gets missed after that. He said, only if you do it with one pointed concentration. Boom. What's that mean? Right? You have to harness your mind in such a way where it stays on what you focus on without wavering. What does that sound like? Meditation, right? Krishna was literally saying, you have to meditate on me. Me as God or God, doesn't matter, he was saying. You have to meditate on God in such a powerful way, in a state of samadhi, then you will know the truth. I assert Christ was saying the same thing, right? He just wasn't given a chance to fully outline what he was trying to say. He ran out of time. So the path of bhakti devotion is that. Both are about realizing beyond your sense of self, lower self, to the greater self, right? So the path of devotion is literally focusing on the greater self, divinity, so strongly where you transform your lower self. The path of wisdom is going through the lower self, seeing what it's not, to realize you're the greater self. You follow? So, Krishna then mentioned there's karma yoga. Let's put this into action. Right? if you have true devotion, and this is what the Protestants are trying to do, right? That's kind of what they're kind of getting at. If you can fully devote every moment to God selflessly, that's karma yoga, right? That's selfless action. That's acting with full faith, right? And in my opinion, that's what the true inner longing of the Protestant is. They want to do that. But there's other limitations there that kind of get in the way, that kind of prevents them from ever achieving that because they don't have the inner journey piece, right? That was taken out of Christianity a long time ago, except for in certain Eastern Orthodox traditions and in mystical Catholicism and Christianity, it's still there, right? But how many Christians, get into that you know of, right? But the point is, this inner journey has been there in every tradition, every faith, on how to reconnect to this inner part of you that's so much more than your thoughts, feelings, and sensations. That's the gist. That's what the ancients were trying to tell us, right? And so Krishna specifically laid out, there's two ways. And now you can see where the different religions fall under. Oh, Christianity, Islam, much of Judaism in a sense, faith-based religions, all the faith-based aspects of Hinduism, where you're praying to God, devoting, doing puja, all fall under bhakti, devotion. Now, our Christians are trying to do that, right? Anytime you're trying to devote yourself, surrender, open your heart, that's what you're doing. And you can go all the way doing that. And there are personalities in India that have proven that. The founder of the Hare Krishna movement, Prabhupada, was his name. Bhaktivedanta, Prabhupada. The founder based his teachings off of a person, Chaitanya, who was alive in the 1500s in India, who fully took Bhakti Yoga to the limit. He was famous for literally getting into an ecstatic trance state with singing and dancing, going from town to town in this pure exalted state of samadhi. Samadhi is this elite state of consciousness that you can get to in meditation or through high focus, to where you're literally at one with what you're focusing on, okay? In a general sense, basic understanding. So he had focused on God so much, that's all he saw and knew. If you can imagine that, right? Similar to how Christ talked. Christ was a living example of that. Taking what we have in the New Testament still as if that's how it happened. Okay? That's what Christ is supposed to embody. That type of path. Who can do that? Right? Even when he's on the cross, he's asking forgiveness for these other people who are nailing him into the cross. Right? He's not mad at them. He's like, Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. Who does that? How can you do that? You can only do it if your mindfulness is so strong, where the pain you're feeling is not affecting your mind in such a way to make you react to not want to feel any of that pain. He got there the same way that the Buddha got there, but in a different way. You follow? That's what I'm trying to say. It's this universal system that's been there to realize who you are that has been outlined in various ways all over the world. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of like lay this out there. Okay. And I don't think I'm going to get into it. That maybe for like, my goal is to have these once a month. So that this may be for another time, where I get into one of the most popular sounds we have that everyone has said at some point, if they've been into any Eastern class or practice, right? What is that?
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And who really knows what that means? Who has looked into it? Great. It means a lot. Okay? It's not just a sound, right? Om is mentioned in the Rig Veda, the oldest writings of India from the beginning, right? It's part of every Indian-based tradition, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Hinduism, and all the offshoots of those, right? So I was going to get into that and actually read an excerpt from one of the Upanishads about Om and what that means, but I don't think we'll have time, so maybe we'll save that for later, okay? But one of my things is to, like I said, clarify universal spirituality, but also to kind of reclaim Hinduism and bring it back to its source. Because it's been really spread out, especially with a lot of what we have today, with everything we're doing in the yoga community, meditation, there's bits and pieces of it, right? But the thing I want to impress upon you, it's a whole system of personal development and cultivation that all these pieces that we're familiar with here are part of, but it's part of a whole. And for example, those of you who know Patanjali's 8 limbs from the Yoga Sutras, who've been into yoga class, taking yoga teacher training, right? You learn about the 8 limbs, right? These steps on how to work on yourself, from like what you shouldn't do, what you should do, postures, right? Get flexible, clear the tension in the body, breath work, learn how to control your breath, and then meditation, the last 3 limbs, last 4 limbs, really, right? Who gets into the last 4 limbs, right? How many yoga teacher trainings do you know of that get into the last 4 limbs? Not many that I know of, right? But again, that's an example of where you don't get the full potential, okay? And I'm not picking on any of these, just so you know, okay? But I want to put things into context, which I think is so important, because if you don't, you're missing out and you get confused. Kundalini Yoga. How many have taken a class? Well, that's just a little piece of the full potential of what usually isn't addressed that can start to have problems. Because what a class like Kundalini Yoga gets into is this energy that's inside of us. It's very powerful, okay? And it's supposed to be addressed as part of a big, grand system. It's not all you do. You're not supposed to only do that. But we have people who just do that, right? Because it can be fun, it can be exciting, you can feel stuff. You start feeling stuff, right? And it's cool. But it's addictive, right? And that again gets into what I was talking about as part of a system which had built into, if it starts getting addictive, what do you do? Are you working on other aspects of the process that will help you move through any attachment you're growing to what you're doing and keep you locked into what you're doing and keep you from progressing, right? So really what I'm meaning by that, again, getting back to the Buddha, right? What he essentially said was, we have sensations every second, things that feel good, things that don't feel good. Even right now, you're feeling stuff, right? Hopefully kind of feel good, feel relaxed, feel good. But they're constantly changing. Next moment, you may not. Next moment, your back may hurt. But the next moment, you just kind of get distracted with like lunch and you're hungry. Things are constantly changing. So when you only do something where you're focusing on feeling good, even though it's helpful, it can be healing, it can be transformative, all these things. But if you just focus on that, you get hooked on that, right? You get hooked on that, and you start to get blind to other things. And this becomes kind of a downside. Every path has a downside, right? And this is kind of the downside of devotional bhakti traditions, energy-based traditions, Kundalini yoga, Taoist yoga, different tantric practices. Anytime you're cultivating energy, there's a downside to where once you are successful, you can get into an ecstatic state. You can start moving some chi, some prana. You start blissing out. You want to hang out there, right? You want to stay there, but you can't. It goes away. So you keep trying to recreate it again and again and again. That's the downside, because you're missing the big picture here. Over here, right? You're kind of built in not to get hooked on that, but you can get so bogged down in analysis. You can kind of lose touch with other things because you get so focused on yourself. Follow? Both of them focus on the self to begin with, right? But each one you can get hooked on yourself. But the point is to kind of rise above yourself, right? That's the point. That's the problem here. You see? So that's kind of why I mentioned Om as well. We use Om all the time. It's a wonderful, powerful mantra and chant for many reasons. But if you can remember the original essence of it, like what they would talk about in the old writings, if you simply chant Om, that's all you got to do. But if you do it right, if you know why you're doing it, right? So maybe Om is for another time. Okay. Now, do we need to take a break? We good? You guys still riveted? Questions? Thoughts?
Beautifully laid out the entire presentation. Amazing. So much wonderful information.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Questions about what you're doing and where it kind of falls in to what I'm talking about, or thoughts you've had about something else and how it falls into.
So the question, who are we? Small question.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll first ask you and hear what you. So I have an idea, but I'd like to hear your response to that.
Who am I?
Yes.
Right. Who am I? That question. So that question becomes the prime focus on some of these traditions, especially what's called the Advaita tradition or the non-dual traditions. It's become famous recently. One personality that really made it famous was a person called Ramana Maharshi, right, in India. By the way, there are, I'm going to digress for just a second, but as I say, there are these examples of beings from our ancient past that's been chronicled and recorded and handed down. Well, the other side is there's more fake ones, okay? And people who may have good motivations, but they're off track, right? So Ramana Maharshi is an example of someone who is not off track. And there are numerous examples all over the world of beings, when you kind of dive into their stories and what they said, it's mind-blowing what they're talking about, what they could do. And so this man really made popular the who am I. His whole approach was simply meditate on who am I. That's all you got to do. That's what that was his thing. Okay. Now, look, to put it into context, he fully awakened when he was 16. Okay. So that was easy for him to do. He literally, I mean, the story, if I remember right, I haven't read this in a while, but his parents were gone. He was 16. he already knew how to meditate a little bit, and he was racked with this question, like, what am I really? Who am I? It's like, what happens if I hold my breath and die? What's going to happen? So he did that. He held his breath supposedly until he passed out. But now, most of us do that. We're not going to experience what he did. But what he experienced was when he passed out, it fully shattered his whole being. And of course, this is obviously karmic, and that's all I need to do. Fully shattered his being, and he went into full awakening. And from that point on, he barely talked. He would go for stretches where he was in full silence. People would ask him questions, he'd just sit with you. And then sometimes, if I recall, he would like write stuff on a chalkboard. People would ask him, why aren't you talking? He'd be like, well, he would write that, words are limiting to the truth. And my presence is all you need, is the gist, right? But my point is, he's an example of one of these beings that is who, being like him is who wrote these original teachings, is the idea, right? So his famous thing was, who am I? Simply ask yourself, who am I? And just meditate on that. That's where it comes from. And so that whole idea is based on this form of Vedanta, or what's called Advaita Vedanta, non-duality. It's one way of looking at things, right? And so the who am I becomes the central way to do that. You focus on that. Who am I? Who am I? Byron Katie, if you're familiar with Byron Katie, right? She was heavy into Advaita. She got much of her information, her technique from Advaita. You see? So it's the same thing, getting really into looking at what you're not. Who am I? Am I the thoughts? No. Right? So that's kind of a technique itself. Who am I? Very similar to a Buddhist approach, analysis, discerning approach. So, but you're asking more of like, who am I really?
Yes.
Correct? Yeah.
Yes.
So how I would answer that is simply how I started. Right? So ultimately at the core, there's an essence to our being, the Atman, if you will, right? The spark of divinity. But the human part, and this is kind of where the models of the world, where they talk about the different layers of the person, the different layers of the being, right? In Hinduism, they talk about the sheaths, the koshas, okay? In Buddhism, they talk about, and it's the skandhas in a different way, very similar. Different traditions talk about them differently, right? There are a lot of, if you get into theosophy and a lot of New Age stuff, it gets even more complicated. 7 layers, 14 layers, right? It just keeps going on and on. It's all an attempt to describe the essence of, what I'm about to say, which is in Hinduism and in Buddhism, there are essentially 5 sheaths, right? The physical body, the energy body, or the astral body, or the sensation body, if you will. In Buddhism, they call it that. The mental body, the body of thoughts, our mind. If you can imagine your mind as a body, right? So the mental body. And then the fourth is what they call the causal body, the volition body in Buddhism. It's kind of the storehouse and source of even the thoughts and all things of your karma. It's literally hell there, if you will. That's how it's described. The samskaras is a term for karmic seeds, okay? That's where it's stored, in the fourth body, if you will, okay? Then the fifth body is the spiritual body, the bliss body. But the fifth body isn't the Atman. That's the thing. That's what's important to remember here. That's what gets mistaken as what is referred to as the Atman. Fifth body is also called the spiritual body, the bliss body, okay? And it's what I would say many higher beings are functioning at, right? And I digress, sidetrack, but and the idea is these bodies, these sheets are layers of consciousness, okay? And so, and they have different functions, different ways of operating, They're gateways to different dimensions, if you will, all of that, right? So, but it's all right here, right now. But our senses are locked into the physical body, primarily, right? That's where we're functioning right now, the physical body, right? But as you know, there's also the energy realm right here, the astral invisible world is the idea, right? It's here right now. Maybe some of you can tune into it better than others, okay? But even if you can't tune into it, it's there, is what this model is based on. That's where we go at night when you astrally project or other things like that is the idea. In that realm. It's a realm, it's a dimension, it's a place, it's a layer to our being as well. You follow? Same thing with the mental body. And they talk about in some of the ancient writings, the mental planes of existence, thought forms as beings. Right? Now this is beyond energy. We're moving beyond energy here. Right? And you know, even in the energy realm, of course, models break that into different subsections and all kinds of stuff. If you're into that, you know, it's all that stuff's out there. But the mental realm, the realms of thought forms, thought beings, is an idea. And beyond that, the unconscious, subconscious realm of is a thing too. It's even hard to describe, right? You can just kind of imagine sitting here. But the spiritual realm, then the fifth body, is a whole separate type of reality, allegedly. All of those make up the person, is the idea. All 5 sheets. You see, each of those sheets have a period of longevity. Is also the idea, right? This is kind of, and then this is where the reincarnation cycle fits in, that the ancients talked about. The more dense the sheath is, the quicker it goes. The quicker it's formed, the quicker it goes, right? So the idea is when you die, your physical body falls away, obviously. Much of your energy body, lower energy aspects will fall away as well, but you retains all the rest. Follow? You will retain all the rest of your bodies, which will then continue on in consciousness in some form. Which then, one way of looking at reincarnation is then you reform a physical body, and predominantly an energy astral body as well, is kind of the idea. You reform, the mental body too. The first 3 bodies are what get disintegrated and get reformed again. Disintegrated, reformed. That's the idea of reincarnation. You follow? So when a body gets disintegrated, you may suddenly find your consciousness now you don't have any eyes anymore, physical eyes or ears, right? But you have astral energy eyes and ears still, is the idea. Now you're in the astral realms. That's what they call the heavenly realms, heaven. In the religious sense, it's what they're talking about, right? But in the ancient world, they would say, look, that's still temporary. It may feel eternal, because now time is different on that side, right? But it's not. But that's describing this whole reincarnation model based on these 5 sheets, which define what a self is, a person. And the idea is, none of that is truly who you are, even that. Remember, as I was saying, the Atman is beyond that. The Atman is forming, the way I think of it is the Atman is localizing consciousness even more to form these 5 sheets. Again and again and again and again and again. And maybe even permutations of it in various, I mean, who knows, really? You can just imagine, right? Fun to imagine. And what's interesting is, in the esoteric traditions, they talk about a fully enlightened being means you have full consciousness and control of each of the 5 sheets. That's what it means, you see? Like, we don't. It's hard for us to even control a physical body at times, right? But imagine if you controlled every layer of your being, not just control you, but full consciousness, full wherewithal, and access to it. That's what we're talking about with full enlightenment. Okay, let me back up. That's a different topic. One aspect of enlightenment is that, okay? So the idea is, once you can master a layer of your being, you can expand your consciousness into it at will. Okay? So if one is able to master the energy layer of their being, the pranamaya kosha, the astral form mastering is a thing, it's a different topic, but what I'm saying is, it's a process. Once you can do that, you gain control over it, which means you can expand your consciousness into more than one. That's what bilocation is. You follow? Or projecting a part of us. Now, some of us may have the ability to project aspects of ourselves with some of the work we do, things like that. High-level shamans can do that. High-level shamans actually are mastering these energy realms where they can literally do that. That's what they're doing. They're traversing these planes. Specifically, it's kind of their thing. Taoists would focus on a lot of that too, because they focus on energy so much. But one who is bilocating, what that means is you're able to hold two containers of consciousness at the same time. You follow?
Mhm.
It's hard enough with one person. Imagine two of you. The idea is two of you means you can control both now. It's like multitasking. And so the ancients would talk about this is what you can do when you can cultivate that.
But what if you forget your job? Would you ever forget it? You wouldn't.
At that level, you wouldn't forget.
You wouldn't, like
Yeah.
not, you, okay.
Maybe when you're beginning and practicing, maybe you forget it. But the point is, like, they talk about these as skills, highly evolved human skills that are possible. And these stories are rampant in the ancient world of high-level beings being in two places at once, or projecting into your dream world, or appearing, so Christ was doing. No, that's different. That's a little bit of what I'm saying, but if you have conscious astral control, it's like beginner level of what I'm saying. But for most people, it's really advanced. I mean, astral projection is really advanced for all of us, right? To be conscious of it. That's remote viewing is similar to astral projection. Remote viewing can be many things, but there can be mental projection as well. You're actually going there in your mind. Going there in your astral body is like, it's a whole different thing. I think maybe a lot of remote viewers do that, go in their astral body. I think a lot of them don't. Most of them probably aren't. They're kind of projecting their mind into, and that's different. It gets nuanced and different, and so the idea is, in the esoteric world, they say to be able to project an energy double at will consciously is a significant human achievement. Then they say, if you can do that, you can project a 3D double. Right? It goes from energy double. First, it's like astral double, when you're dreaming, you can start doing that. But then you can project an energy double right here and now. Like if I'm here, I go and check up, at home, send up, but it's more than just sending your mind though. It's literally sending your energy body, a duplicate over there. That's how they would talk about it, right?
The teachings of the masters of the Far East when the master actually ended up in another country to meet with I've only just.
Yeah, he's sending his 3D double. He's formed his physical body around the energy body then. That's badass.
Yeah.
That's next level beyond that, right? Yes, that's full true physical bilocation. And there are stories of that even now that you can come across. And one of my favorite ones is this Buddhist lady monk, Dipa monk. Some of you may know of her, right? She's a small book. She actually spawned a lot of the insight meditation movements in the West, the Buddhist movements. Her students kind of spawned that, like Goldstein and a whole list of other names were connected to her, right? But she was this little Indian lady who started meditating at a late age. She went all the way, and she was seen bilocating. Eyewitness accounts of her bilocating, of her levitating, and she would just laugh and giggle and like play it off. And they were like, I saw you floating while you were hanging your clothes the other day. She's like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. She was so humble.
No big
That's the
deal.
thing. So 3D bilocation is next level. then the ultimate is multiple selves. Right? This is what the most advanced beings, in my opinion, in the cosmos are doing. They're recreating multiple selves for various reasons, right? But they're able to, not just one anymore. They can literally multitask so beyond our minds. They can literally create infinite doubles. Yeah,
To go back to who are we?
I digressed, didn't I? Yeah.
Which you're
Anything.
explaining in different ways, I think, good. You seem to have expressed that if we can observe with neutrality what's going on, that may be who we are, the observer,
Right.
from a place of
Right.
just.
So the
this is
first
what that
experience, kind of
moment-
what you're addressing, is the observer, the witness,
Okay.
right? Is what you come across when you're meditating. As you progress in any form of meditation, that idea becomes bigger and bigger. Who's observing, right? Is kind of what you're saying, yeah. Because the observer is noticing the thoughts. The observer is noticing the sensations and feelings. And they're changing, they're moving, right? So the idea is you can't be something you're observing at a fundamental level, right? Now, at a fully enlightened level, you're doing the same thing. We're not talking about that. At a basic functional level, if you're looking at something, you're not that, right? And that's how it's described to help people understand. If you're looking at your thoughts, you know you're not just your thoughts. And the point of that is to help you disengage from your thoughts and not identify with your thoughts, right? If you're having a negative thought and you whatever it is, I am this type of person, or if you can get into observer mode, you're realizing, oh, there's a part of me having the thought that's saying, I'm this type of person. I'm observing that. And that then helps you then cultivate that awareness. Oh, and this is very similar to people who are aware of parts therapy, internal family systems, and psychology. They're doing very similar things, right? Looking at different parts of yourself. They're all here right now. And different ones are kind of come into play. And when you get triggered, a specific part takes over, right? That's what's happening. But the observer, the witness, is never part of that. Always observing it.
So is it possible that's who we are?
So yes, the deeper teachings would say that's still not truly who you are, right? So in Vedanta, they talk about if the sun is God and there's a mirror, sunlight's hitting the mirror, and from the mirror, you see a reflection of, say, like an apple, or say you, okay? The observer is the mirror. You're still not seeing the sun, is how they describe it.
So the beingness is source, is the sun, that everything emanates.
Right. And hence why the ultimate teaching is absolute reality is one. It's the sun. Right? Or the cosmic version of the sun.
And then in that space, you have control of all the levels, and
Yes. Because you realize there's
You
nothing to
are that.
control.
you are that. So
Yes.
there's nothing- Got it.
And that's how such beings do these things that we read about and fantasize about. Right? So the reflection, up to the reflection, is the 5 layers of our being, is the idea, you see? The 5 sheets come up to the reflection. And so even the reflection is still, it feels like the observer. So ultimately what they talk about is you are able to observe the observer. Ultimately. In meditation is the grand goal in that process, to be able to do that. And once you do that, then you realize it all kind of falls away. There's nothing to observe. It's all just is happenings right now. But then you can function as a human too, is the key, you know.
When you're describing the oneness, that's when I feel like I fully come alive, when I hear like the unity, we're so duality.
Yeah.
Even more the layers you're talking about.
Right, we feel it, we know it when you hear it, like, oh yeah,
But like how I see it sometimes is that it is God, he, she, is all of us having these experiences. So the truth of our essence is that we are God,
Right.
right?
That is the truth. Yeah.
That is the truth. But it's all separated, and that's where we're living in separation. And that's being in the church, the separation theology. It was so hard to be in the church for so long. Even Jesus is saying, Father and I are one, but nobody would explain that, you
Right.
know? So now
Right.
my heart is just so open to like the oneness, and I feel like all the different religions are kind of expressing that,
Yeah.
going back to the being one.
Yeah.
That
Exactly.
it is only him, and he's having like beautiful experience through me showing up in my life and who I am.
Yeah.
And
How they describe it is through each one of your eyes, right?
Yeah.
It's the one reality shining through.
And that's the thing that lights me up the most, is knowing I'm one with God. That's it.
Right.
And that leads to all this other fun stuff.
But as it's shining through, though, all those layers it's shining through starts to dilute it and cloud it. And as it happens, you start to lose that light, and you get focused on those layers, and then you start to function from that place. That's it. You know, so it's really just remembering, reawakening to how we're supposed to be. And then you can feel the connection to all things.
Yeah, it's not to reject our humanity, right? It's supposed to be all of it,
But that's the hardest part.
right?
That's the work.
Not to just be so up there, high or whatever. It's
Right.
how you bring the full experience.
If you're doing an authentic spiritual tradition or practice, they will talk about that. That's when you know how to bring it down, how to ground, how to connect to the earth,
Yes.
right? How to connect to your body, how to connect to the ancestors, you know, how to connect to what's tangible is the idea, right? So
Yeah.
if you're doing that, you know you're on the right track.
Mm.
Yes.
That's interesting. I love what you said about the mirror and the sun. And that'll stick with me forever. Like, that'll be something that I'll remember forever, that analogy. It's just, I'm curious, like, are we actually able to, when you're talking about bilocating in some of these higher levels of consciousness type things that people have achieved, aren't those, is that them just being at the mirror level? Because, I mean, once you are connecting to the level of the sun, it seems to me like that's, you know, I don't know that we would be able to achieve that in our 3D/4D level of consciousness that we are living in right now, right?
So all I can say is based on the examples
Mhm.
of these other beings that we have,
Mhm.
it is possible.
And they're connecting beyond the mirror level, is what you're saying.
Yes, being in full awareness of that level, right? And having full wherewithal of their entire being, not being controlled by their other layers. They control all the layers. Their consciousness, which is one with all things,
Right.
is mastery of their entire self. You see,
Yeah.
that's the thing. And so when you have that, then you can embody it. Right. And that's kind of the grand goal, to embody, bring divinity down into the most dense part of us, or to reconnect that divinity into the density. Right. So what I would say is, according to these examples, it is possible, even though we may not understand it. But we see what they did and taught, you know, and their examples and their stories. Like, oh, now I will add, the big warning is, okay, it's good to talk about and look at these powers and the end goal, but the real work is you should forget about it. You really need to forget about all that, because again, getting back to the Buddha, when he outlined, because he talked a lot about enlightenment as well, obviously, right? But the way he described it was very specific. And it wasn't about powers, right? Specifically in the Theravada tradition, he outlined 4 stages of enlightenment. Okay? The first stage, which is what I'm going to talk about, basically he describes what you need to work on to be at that 4th stage according to how he was, describing it. Okay? And these stages are based on 10 fetters, 10 chains that bind us, that keep us from fully being who we are, right? These 10 chains. So the first stage is working on the first 4 chains, basically. First chain, one of the main chains, anger and hatred. Work on that. Right? I mean, the most practical. Nope, nothing about powers, nothing about doing anything. It's, can you transform the anger and hatred in you? And you don't have to be perfect, because the first level of enlightenment is, the way he described it is, at least half of your anger and hatred is gone. Just half. Okay? By the second level, it'll all be gone. But the first level, at least half. You can do that. Right? So that's an example, right? That's what's really important. It's the basic, fundamental things which get back to how we are getting attached to our reality based on our senses, and how are we handling it. When something happens that we're not wanting, do you react with anger, and how much? And are you in control of it? Right? Yeah.
And as far as I know, anger or hatred is that you're a victim to what's going on around you. You're not observing it neutrally,
Yeah.
or you're still resourceful
Right.
to take a loving action, I'll say.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And when we reveal like a mindset that we have.
Right.
The victim mindset, you're gonna get lots of that, yeah.
And so to bring this back to what I was saying though, that victim mindset, that angry place, is just a part that's triggered right then, coming to the surface and taking over for a certain amount of time. That's the work. So that's that part that comes up is a part of you that's become angry. It can't just go away. So when the Buddha said it must be transformed, he meant it becomes neutralized into just pure vitality. Because anger is energy, right? That's really what it is. It's a very charged amount of energy that you're bringing out. It's easy to lose control over. So can you neutralize that into pure raw prana chi vitality? What is that? That's mindfulness practice. Again, right? Same thing, getting back to how do you handle what you feel? Well, yes.
Speaking of neutralizing, like this is something that's always been very interesting to me, because like when I think of God now, I grew up in the church, but when I think of God now, I think of like pure source energy. But it's interesting how like Christianity assigned a gender to God as a male, and then you were saying like Hinduism kind of, and maybe in another way, assigns a gender to God as like the mother energy.
If you choose to.
If you choose to, but like, why do you think we gravitate towards wanting to assign a gender type energy to a deity that is probably very neutral and encompassing,
Yeah.
both equally?
Right. What Hinduism and Vedanta would say simply is that because that's how human minds work. Right.
So
We can't conceive of all that is without any form that's formless, nameless, everywhere. We can't conceive of that generally. So we have to give it a form, a name, And so it's easy to give it a gender, a story, things like that. And so in Hinduism, they basically say, you're free to do whatever you want with that. Male, female, neuter, whatever, human, animal, non-human, this color, that color, this story, that story. It's up to you. It's all good. And so a Hindu knows, oh yeah, you may believe in Krishna, or you may believe in Great Spirit, or you may believe in Christ, or you may believe in Durga. It's all the same. True Hindu would never argue over that. Or Krishnas argue though. I had arguments with them. It's just Krishna.
Yep.
Yes.
I'm sorry, were you gonna say something?
No.
As exciting as it's been to kind of head out onto a wider path of this universal spirituality that you've been speaking about. There are times where I feel like kind of cherry picking everything I like from all the different, and you and I have been talking about this for a few years now. There are times where I wonder if, with the time I have left in this incarnation, if I'm somehow diluting my spiritual practices by being so wide. And yet I want to embrace and I want to learn everything that you're talking about and have a meditation practice. But can you speak to that?
So that's a good question. That's a very important question. And it's what I would say, it's not about what you believe. And this will be something maybe we'll go into in future gatherings where, I talked a lot about, in a general sense, this universal spirituality, right? Kind of where it comes from, these ideas. But the other part of this, though, there is a specific path. And there are specific goalposts and sections on that path that are important to cover for spirituality. I think that's what you're kind of alluding to. So as long as you cover those, you're on the path. And so what I mean by that, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but for example, the first section, obviously it coincides with the first part of the Buddhist Eightfold Path, right view, right? And what that means is have a way of looking at things. Is your view right? And today was a lot about right view, is the thing. What are you believing? Question what you're believing. Is it true for you or not? Right? And is what you're believing, does it align with what probably is most beneficial for you in terms of to believe? So it's right view, right? Buddhists take that very in a Buddhist sense. I expand it into, can you expand your view of God? Can you expand your view of soul? Do you see yourself in the way that is most functional? That's what I call right view, right? So that's kind of, belief systems, views. Those can change and morph depending on what you're exposed to, what you want, which trajectory you want to go. But also then beyond, that's just the first step. Beyond that is then a lot of it, I kind of take the Buddhist Eightfold Path, kind of overlay it with Patanjali's 8 limbs as well, and come up with this like bigger model that you can just kind of check off, right? So like after right view is, for example, right action. How's your behavior? And so and why make that the first 2 is, those usually are the beginning for most authentic spiritual, traditions and commandments, yamas, niyamas, the 5 silas of Buddhism, right? How's your behavior? Right? You can do as much spiritual stuff as you want. You can meditate, but if you're not being authentic, if you're lying, right? You're going to get derailed. Karma will catch up to you. Right? And I speak from experience, right? I've had to learn all these things myself to, oh yeah, I can't get away with these things. Right? So it's your behavior. Are you staying in line? Right? Are you causing the least amount of suffering to yourself and others? Right? Are you respecting what is yours and what is not yours? These basic things. And most people have to work on that their whole lifetime. And that's okay. But that's the foundation, you see? Right view, right action, behavior, then, you get into right again, with the Eightfold Path, right energy. Are you cultivating your energy properly? Which is a whole big now rabbit hole, which is about, are you cultivating the chi, the prana, all these things we talked about today, every time you get triggered, how are you handling that energy? It all falls in the same category. So that will bring you health. It'll bring you vitality. It'll prepare your kundalini. Right. So that's like a big category. Are you doing any of that? Is what I would say. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and then of course, right concentration. Are you able to focus your mind? Do you have some meditative technique, some way to be less distracted? Is how it begins, and then you can cultivate that into higher forms of focus and concentration, right? And then, of course, right mindfulness. The other big category, which we talked about a lot. How are you handling yourself? Are you able to transform these parts of you into something greater? Right? Which comes from that insight wisdom I talked about. You see, so that's kind of an example of what I mean, like this, that's kind of a universal path. And you can kind of see where things fall in depending on what you're doing. And you kind of check off.
And if it's authentic, then it will be intuitive as well.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's also not linear. And it's not only that. Like someone can just cultivate behavior and go all the way. And that's more of like a karma yoga path, right? Someone who is such a good person, right? They spend a lot of lifetimes being such a good person. Then they become a very saintly person. They emanate this love and compassion all the time. Maybe they're not even meditating, right? They don't know anything about energy. It doesn't matter. They have their own views of things, but they're just emanating love and compassion, always trying to help, do good. In every moment they do that, they're clearing their karma. They're transforming themselves. They don't even realize it, maybe. Maybe they do. You know what I mean? So those are examples like that too. Or someone can hyper focus on, mindfulness, go all the way. So that's kind of my answer to what you're saying. Like, okay, know if you're just checked off those major categories. Just work on those.
It's about 108 just for a time check.
Okay. So I wanted to meditate. We won't get to that.
So maybe ask and see how often people want to do this.
Do you guys want to meet once a month? Yes?
I would do that at the minimum.
Mhm.
Okay.
I would personally would even do bi-monthly. So,
So my original agenda was to talk, maybe read some excerpts from some spiritual, traditions focused on some specific topics, specifically at times. Today was very general, right? And then have maybe some chanting, have some meditation. This isn't so much for guidance with meditation, unless it kind of comes up. I have like separate things I do for that. But and then Q&A, maybe even eventually down the road have like a kirtan as part of this, things like that, but that's kind of my general idea. Yes.
So where would we find out if you're going to have this again? Is it on your Karuna Center website?
Yeah, it'll be on there. I'm gonna have an Eventbrite
Okay,
site as well
okay.
for all these events. And if I have your email,
So
I'll
if
specifically
you
make sure.
register through Eventbrite, you have our email. right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You'll see these things in Eventbrite as well, but I'm gonna have it'll be on my website as well. And then I'll have a
And you
newsletter.
also offer more elementary meditation
Yeah.
classes?
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
And that would also be on the website?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Okay.
thank you guys
thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was great.
being present. And I'll try to, any specific topics down the road that come to mind.
You'd be great just talking.
I know one person who's not here, she really wants me to go into death and dying,
Nice.
as an example. What happens when you die? And what do they say, experience. So any other examples, thoughts?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
just don't believe in death anymore, so I'm just laughing. You're just
Some
transitioning.
form of it.
We're just transitioning.
How to be more
And
present.
it's an amazing experience.
Yeah.
How to be more present. So just more into mindfulness in general. That means, yeah,
You're doing it, you know.
it's one of the most important things.
Okay.